Hi, everyone. This is Miranda with the Valuable Voices podcast. I am extremely honored to have Dawn on today from the Faith to Flourish, and she is an author of From Guilt to Grace, Hope and Healing for Christian Moms of Addicted Children. So, Dawn, I am blessed and honored to have you, and I can't wait to hear your story.
Thank you for having me, Miranda. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, we got connected in a Christian podcast group. I love just hearing people's story. Like that's how I feel like we build people's faith. And that's why I have this podcast and this platform is really just to share. I think everybody has a valuable voice, but I especially love, just highlighting authors and, hearing God's testimony. So, Dawn, let's just jump in. I would love to just kind of hear your story, wherever you want to start.
Well, thank you again. I was thinking about our conversation today, and I thought, I really cannot talk about my present story until I talk a little bit about my past story.
Yeah.
And I think I've been on the planet many years now. And so there's just a culmination of events that have brought me to where I'm at today. And us discussing the book that I've recently written. And it's kind of interesting when people say, "Oh, I want to write a book," and God's given me this idea to write a book. I know for some people, they can write books very quickly. I'm amazed when I talk to authors who have 30 books under their belt and just a lifetime of writing. For me, this one was so painstaking and took so much time and effort that I feel like, hey, it might be the one and only book I have in me. We'll have to see. That being said, I have co-authored another book and I have contributed in devotional books, a few devotional books as well. So I have a little bit of experience there, but this book was a lifetime in the making.
Mm.
And a lot of memoirs are like that. They're books where someone's telling their story of their, something they've gone through as a child and now they've worked their way up. In my case, that's basically what happened too. I grew up in a home where it was pretty much an average home. My dad and mother were both public service type employees. My dad was a fireman, and my mother later in my childhood worked for the phone company. In between, they had a business that they owned together. And so there was just always customer service and all of that involved. And just average people is what I'm trying to say. I didn't grow up in any kind of a fancy home or anything like that. Kind of blended in with the rest of the neighborhood. Dad being a fireman, though, I think he was very prone in that environment to drinking and just a lot of, they like to get together and, kind of let off steam after, I think, a very intense work day. So
Yeah.
my dad was somebody who, when I noticed when dad drank, he wasn't a friendly or a funny kind of drinker like my uncles were. I had two other uncles who were also in the fire department. He got mean and argumentative, not just with, the family, but with pretty much everyone.
Mm.
And he was not one to at all like cause me to be afraid of him as far as hitting me or any kind of physical violence. But he just had this really mean, loud voice. And it just was very scary for me. And so I think a lot of my coping skills with people pleasing, perfectionism, trying to control my environment, I think a lot of that stuff happened way back when I was a little kid.
Mm.
And so, I think it was just a coping skills. I don't really think I even had a conscious mindset as far as what was going on. It was just me adapting to my environment. Being the oldest child, that also came into play because I felt that tremendous burden to keep my brother and sister kind of in line because then if mom and dad weren't mad and they weren't upset and they weren't fighting, then dad wouldn't drink and just the whole thing.
Yeah.
So my dad loved us very much. He took good care of us otherwise, but I think he just had a lot of trauma growing up in his own childhood, and that was how he coped. And then my mother, I think because she didn't know how to deal with it, she just tended to be reclusive and angry and not really show us a lot of love or affection either. So as I got older and as I was growing up, to me, love and acceptance were earned.
Mm.
They were something you had to do, you had to earn them. And like I said, our parents didn't know what they didn't know back then. They came from a different generation. And I know I never questioned that either one of my parents loved me, but I just developed these coping skills from all this trauma. So when I was about 4 years old, now up until then, my parents, I wasn't really raised in a Christian home. My dad never went to church unless it was a funeral or a wedding. Mom took us on the holidays to the little Lutheran church. And but I did feel God's love there. I did feel that he loved me and I could feel his presence. I liked what it felt like to go to church, attend Sunday school, even at such a young age. But when I was about 4 years old, I remember my parents arguing and me kind of hiding. And I felt God. I felt him like, get a hold of me and take my hand. And he said, take my hand and hold on and never let go because you're going to need me for this life. And it's
Wow.
the first time I remember hearing God speak to me.
Mm.
Probably wasn't audible, but to me, it was just as audible as if a mother was talking to me.
Yeah.
And so as you know, as I got older, I really was asking mom, take me to church. My mother would take me to a Lutheran church. And it was probably when I was about maybe 10 or 11 that somebody said born again.
Mm.
And I learned what that meant. And I think I probably was at some youth event or something, if I remember right, something like Billy Graham related, that they had for the kids, and learned what born again meant. And I actually went forward to receive the Lord.
Mm.
So on top of, besides all of that, I had, uh, felt like I'd kind of discipled myself, if you want to call it that, because I would go to church, but I didn't really have anybody that was kind of showing me the ropes of what it means to, be a Christian and walk in a Christian life and everything. I did the best I could. And so that means that I had hiccups along the way, just like any other teenager trying to figure it out. It wasn't like, the angels started singing from heaven and
Right.
this crown dropped on my head when I was 4 years old. And I never
Yeah.
made a mistake from then on.
Mm.
All the coping skills, everything that I was still trying to figure out. And then my parents separated and divorced, and all those things that went on in that very volatile household. I took all those fears
Mm.
into getting married and having children of my own.
Yeah.
And so when I had my first son, first thing was, I'm just not going to raise him like my parents did. I'm not going to drink around them. I'm going to put them in Christian school, any kids I have, really vet their friends and all of that. So for me, what happened when it was actually my middle son who was in his last year of high school that first struggled with substance abuse and getting in with the wrong crowd. I had taken him out of the Christian school. My husband had numerous back surgeries and he was not working anymore.
Mm.
And I went back to work full time. And so during that time, I was trying to police the kids, but also because moms seem to have really radar. Sometimes dads will let things just kind of go. But I was always like, something not right that kid, because I knew he was always having good grades. He was really into sports. He played instruments, and now all of a sudden I saw things slipping.
Mm.
And I was like, what's wrong with you? But see, drugs weren't on my radar because I had been used to being around alcohol. I think I maybe during that time had maybe been around a few people that were high and from marijuana or whatever back in those days, because this was close to 20 years ago.
Okay.
So I don't know, I might have been around somebody that was like under the influence of drugs, but it wasn't the people I hung with, so I wasn't aware of what to look for. So when he was acting suspicious, I didn't know, hey, like you can go to the store and you can buy a drug test or any of that. I thought I'm gonna have to take him to the emergency room, and I don't know if they'll even run one without having a reason for it.
Mm.
Him being a minor, right? So it was, I think I did catch him smoking cigarettes, and I was like, oh, great, my kid is just on a highway to hell. And so, but one time he did come in, it was probably shortly thereafter, and he took my husband aside and he told my husband, he goes, I've been, hanging out with these kids. They had a garage band, and he played a lot of instruments and everything. And so he said, anyway, we thought we were smoking pot, but there's something in it we can't get off. And
Mm.
that's really what it was. And so that's a very real problem. It was a problem back then that they would mix or blend other addictive substances into other drugs so that people did not realize and didn't understand what they were playing with, especially young kids who are naive and immature and all of that. Thought he was cool smoking pot, and the next thing he knew, he was dealing with something that was much bigger problem. And really it was like a cocktail, to be honest with you. When they did his toxicology, there were several addictive properties in there.
Wow.
So we, panicked. I just hit the panic button. Like there's no other way.
Mm.
Like to say, my brain believed everything it had heard out there. Once an addict, always an addict. This is going to end in prison or dead. Like that was just where my brain was at. And I was just terrified. It took a while. It wasn't at that point that God was really showing me that I'd been parenting with fear anyway, that this had gone on my entire life. That's all I knew was fear.
Mm.
So with that son, because he had come and said, look, he wanted to go to college. He was just thinking he had to be part of the cool guys club. And this is what he got involved in. And, so now we are taking him to the professionals, getting him counseling, church, discipleship programs, faith-based programs, all of this. And because he hadn't been into it too long and he was young, they really felt like, he could do this that way, like just on if you want to call it outpatient or just community support and counseling. And so when he graduated from high school that year, he decided, it would be smarter for him to not be hanging out with those friends. He kept trying to go back with those friends and, then they would just get back into trouble again.
Mhm.
So he finally realized if I'm going to make a difference, I have to quit hanging out with the kids who don't care, that still want to keep partying and still want to keep doing all this stuff. If I want to improve my life, I need to hang out with people who love the Lord, and this is their goal. And so I'm not going to say it was easy, but if I were to look back as a mom, and God's like, you have to go through this.
Mm.
You have to. I would choose that way over the next story I'm going to tell you. The next story I'm going to tell you is once that son was off and doing his thing, he actually went into a program, a faith-based program, learned how to be an addiction counselor, mental health counselor, all of that. Later went back to college and went into a different line of work because, that wasn't something he wanted to stay in, but he was in it for about 4 or 5 years. So now we're probably about maybe a year after his situation. He seems to be calming down. Things are looking good. He's in school, all of that. And his brother, it was actually his older brother who had gone to college, graduated already, all of that, but he had suffered from a lifetime of stomach issues.
Mm.
And it wasn't until he was about 25 that they finally figured out that he had a congenital birth defect that was going to need surgery. And so he had just basically suffered this entire life, a lot of mental health things, anxiety, social anxiety, because he couldn't hold down things. He would throw up, different things were going on because of this. And later we found out my uncle and a couple of my cousins had the same problem. They all had to have surgery. But, family doesn't always talk, right? Everybody
Right.
lives in different states and all of that. So he had this surgery. But what happened was they prescribed him very strong narcotics at the time when they were telling us that those narcotics were not addictive.
Okay.
Okay, so that would have been a good maybe 13, no, it's longer than that, maybe 15, 16 years ago.
Okay.
That's when we later found out Purdue and all of them got in big trouble for lying about the addictive properties of these opiates. And so my son got addicted to pain meds. And then along with that, because of his spiraling mental health, anti-anxiety medications, benzodiazepines, all of it. And his problem became he was already living out of the house. So his problem actually spiraled him downward more
Mm.
and took him more down that path of what every mother fears when her child is struggling with addiction. Because now there were mental health breakdowns, there were car accidents, there were arrests, there was a couple of suicide attempts,
Mm.
actual psychosis, mental health breakdowns. My son running the streets, of another state and us trying to get him help and locate where he was and not knowing what was going on and trying to communicate with the police and first responders that he wasn't dangerous, but he was seeing little green men.
Wow.
So we kind of had to go through that whole thing with him. And that, of course, means that, there's going to be longer consequences, harder consequences, all of that.
Mm.
In the process of all of this, the Lord he spoke to me and said, you're going to start a ministry. And I was still at that breaking point myself. I had gotten to the place where I was obsessed over fixing my son.
Mm.
I was doing research constantly, looking at all the different treatment centers. I mean, should I send him to Mexico and get him on this thing, that will hopefully fix his brain? Should I send him to Costa Rica? Like, I'm just operating out of sheer terror.
Yeah.
And and every time I step foot into a support group, all I hear are the statistics and the parents that have been at this for 20, 30 years and have and listening to the other parents talking about what their experience was really just bringing me down.
Mm,
I it wasn't that they were saying anything wrong, it was just feeding my fears.
yeah.
And so I got into that place where I was like, God, I'm ready to snap.
Mm,
And I do remember one day my husband said to me, Dawn, you're going to worry yourself to death. And I tell this story a lot because it was my aha moment
yeah.
where I was like, you're right. I am going to worry myself to death. You can put that on my tombstone. She worried herself to death. And
Mm,
right then, again, I heard that same voice that had said to me all those years ago, no, he wanted me to hold his hand. Now he was saying, no, I wanted to say she trusted God.
mm,
So at that moment, knowing that I heard him, I was like, well, what does it look like to trust him? Yes, Jesus, I want to trust you, but what does it look like to trust you? So God's laying this burden on my heart to start a ministry. I'm feeling really broken and feeling like I don't even know what God would want me to do at this point. And the vision he gave me for the ministry was, like these sheep, they're in this pasture, they're super happy, they're having a great time, they're all comfortable, they feel safe, they feel nurtured and cared for. And I just remember saying, anything but addiction, God. And it's like he went radio silent on me. And looking back, I'm trying to remember like when did he give me the vision of this, and then when did this aha moment happen? But they happened very, very close to each other.
okay.
And so now all of a sudden I'm realizing, oh my gosh, he is talking about addiction, and I'm not there yet. Like I'm not there yet, God. So I'm having this. I felt like um, Moses, when Moses said, I'm slow of speech and he's stuttering, and Gideon doesn't feel, he's afraid and he doesn't feel ready to go, and he's got all these fleeces going. And now God's challenging me to do something that I don't feel ready for. Like, not that I'm not willing, I just felt like you just picked the wrong girl.
Yeah.
And so when I finally was like, okay, God, whatever you want me to do, what does it look like? And I had at that point met somebody who was writing to other moms and encouraging other moms. She was a Christian, but not necessarily writing to the Christian community. And her and I got to talking about her material. And that's when her and I co authored the book together that was a workbook to help moms who were struggling with all of this. Then the Lord said, okay, now I want you to start a Facebook group for moms. And I had not even been on Facebook. This was probably about 10 years ago, probably about 9, 10 years ago. I was only on there because our pastor was sick and he had cancer. And so
Mm,
that's where everyone was getting their updates. And I had just kind of gotten my own profile, seeing some of my cousins on there. And I'm like, I don't have any clue how to do this. And what are we going to do? And no, that Facebook doesn't need another addiction support community out there. There's plenty of them. Why do we need this? And the Lord's like,
mm,
just do it. So finally I went and Googled and figured out how to start one. And I went on and started one. And then the Lord said, okay, the community is going to be to pray for the children, encourage the moms, and glorify me. So I knew at that point it wasn't going to be like an advocacy type group or an education group. It really was going to be to build up the mom's
wow.
faith, encourage them, pray for our children, and just really focus on that. And in that around that same time is really when he was working on me. He said, I want you to quit spending all your time, effort, resources Googling how to help your child who's an adult, and start working on allowing me to work on your heart and work on the things that are going on in your life that need addressing. So it
Wow.
all was kind of happening at the same time, where he's taking this broken vessel and having me start blogging about what our family was going through. So I started the Faith to Flourish then, so that there was a place for me to blog, and
Wow.
started a group about the same time. And that's really how I initially got into the ministry. And so I would really kind of call it a writing and a teaching ministry, and that I was doing some coaching and some biblical coaching and not counseling, because I'm not a licensed counselor, but I am a certified coach and
Mm,
trauma coach and all of that. I was doing that. Recently, I put that on hold unless God tells me to pick it up again, because of writing the book and all the stuff that goes on around all of that.
yeah.
But I do have a good group on Facebook, and we have
Wow.
administrators, and so we're still, out there doing it. So anyway, at one point, the Lord was telling me, if you're going to trust me in this situation, you have to know me. And you
Mm,
don't know me, because if you knew me, you wouldn't be so afraid all the time,
Aw,
right? Because
so
perfect love
true.
casts out all fear, right? And I was
Yeah,
living terrified all the time.
yeah.
And the only way I knew how to cope with being afraid, rather than crying and falling apart, because by all outward appearances, I went to work every day. I looked like I was handling life. But inside, my brain was just constantly worrying and thinking all the worst case scenarios. So he needed to work on my heart and on my relationship with him. And that's what God wanted me to really work on, was like, stop trying to fix your kid all the time. Trust me with him and let
Mm,
me work on your heart. And in the process, I took this deep dive into the scriptures, because where do you get to know God? And
absolutely.
the world tends to make you think that I don't talk at all about addiction in the Bible. Like, I've got nothing to say about it. I'm radio silent. But he reminded me there's nothing that he doesn't cover in his word. It
Mm,
may not look like what we talk about. It may not sound like it because we may have different language, but it's in there.
mm,
So I started realizing, gosh, he's talking about gluttony and drunkardness. Oh, now he's talking about idolatry, and thou shalt have no other gods before me. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. All these things are starting to happen, and he's starting to show me how very concerned he is about my child, but also about me.
yeah.
And I ended up in the book of Hosea and started writing a Bible study for God's relentless love for wandering hearts and how
Mm,
all hearts wander. I was really looking at boundaries, just trying to understand boundaries and biblical boundaries. And he's like, okay, we're going to go over here. And so, through the result of writing all of that, the Lord said, I want you to step back and I want you to actually make this a book, because these moms are not prepared to do this in depth of a Bible study. Like, their brains aren't there. They're as broken as you were, and healing came through studying my word, but don't right now they don't need to be overwhelmed.
mm,
So, oh, and by the way, when you write this book, I want you to put your stories in there. Well, when you're teaching and you're writing Bible studies, it's you can kind of step back and just present what the Bible says and tell stories about the characters in the Bible. When the Lord asks you to write a book, now all of a sudden you have to kind of air your own family story.
sure. Yeah.
I wasn't quite sure how he was going to have me do that. I wasn't sure how that was going to look, where I could protect the privacy of my family, especially my son, who was a minor.
Yeah.
The first experience, my child was a minor at the time. It
Mm,
wasn't until nearing he was in his senior year, and it wasn't until close to the end of his senior year that he turned 18. So he's been very quiet and very private, because this has been a long time for him. It was a hiccup in his life, and he doesn't want it to define him.
right.
And, he's John, very successful, been married for over 10 years now and doing well. And that wasn't something that he wanted to have shape or define him. Now,
Right.
my
Right.
older son has also had his own podcast. He's had, he doesn't have it right now, but he has had it where he's brought people on, interviewed them that were in recovery or that were going through
Mm,
that whole addiction process themselves. And so he's been more open about it. He's in the film industry. So I think it's more comfortable for him to kind of share his story. So it was like,
sure.
Lord, how do you want me to do this? I don't want to feel like I'm throwing one kid under the bus and
Yeah.
protecting the other one.
Yeah.
Then, in the middle of all of this, my husband, who I told you had numerous back surgeries, was also addicted to the pain meds and got addicted to gambling. So at this
Wow.
point, all the men in my life, my brother had struggled he weighed 900 pounds at one point. So my brother had a food addiction. All my uncles, my grandfathers, everybody had struggled with addiction in one capacity or another, one form or another, whether it was behavioral or substance. And
Wow.
so I'm like, Lord, you're asking me to write a book and tell stories in here, and I don't want to hurt anyone in the process. I don't want anyone to have a misunderstanding or feel that I did this, just because I had to get it out there. I kind of had to vomit it out to the world. If something good isn't going to come out of it, then I'm okay with it not being published. And that was something I had to really wrestle with God, was even at the end asking my sons, should I change your name? Should I write this under a ghost name? What should I do? My husband's like, throw my story in there because I'm a miracle and I don't care.
Mm,
I want it in there. And then interestingly enough, my brother only read the first intro, and I think a little bit of the first chapter. He's like, Well, Dawn called dad an alcoholic. And well, I don't call people alcoholics or addicts or anything because we're not to label them in society. And so we will describe the behavior, not the person, or label the person. So I knew I didn't call him that. But it was interesting when I talked to my brother, he's 7 years younger. And by the time I was out of the house is when my parents were separating and divorcing. And
Mhm.
so I realize now that my brother grew up mostly with my mom,
Wow.
spent some time with my dad, but not in the environment that I grew up in. So he remembers things differently.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we kind of had to have a little conversation about that afterwards. He's like, oh, yeah, and I didn't want to open up too many wounds for him because obviously he has his own struggles. So it's a really hard thing to write about. And the
Yes.
journey requires us that as writers who are called to write these type of stories, and mine isn't just a memoir, it's speckled with family stories in there, but it really is a how to move from that guilt and shame and
Mm.
self-blame to that place of living in healing and hope and freedom through God's grace. And my journey in there is how I got from that place to this, to this new place of having that living in God's grace. But
Wow.
it is a hard thing, because you have to really wrestle with all of that. And there's been days when I've said, gosh, Lord, can I just get a hold of my publisher and just, can we pull this thing? Because it's just too much. But here we
Mhm.
are, and we're getting through it with God's
Oh,
grace. So that's
wow.
the
Well,
story. I'm sorry, I know it was long, but I had to kind of
no,
share all of
I
that
love
background
that.
to get us to where we're at.
No, and you're such a good storyteller. So thank you for sharing. So did you end up putting their story in the book?
I did. I put their
Okay.
story in the book, and they were okay with it. And everyone who has read it has told me that it was handled with
Mm.
grace
Great.
and that I was very careful with it.
Hmm.
And I felt like the Lord had me write it from a few details, but mostly what did it feel like?
Hmm.
The emotions that were wrapped around this situation versus all of the details of it. And
Wow.
that's only by his grace of the Lord penning it for me in those places because
Yeah.
there was times I just kept editing and my husband's like, Dawn, it's fine. And I'm like, no, I've got to cut back more. The interesting thing about this book was that most people, when they write a book and their developmental editor gets a hold of it, they start carving away words. They're like, there's too many, kill your darlings, all of
Huh.
this. I had one story in there that I just liked it. I just liked it. I thought it was a pretty story. And it was about Hosea and Gomer. And she goes, Dawn, you're not writing fiction. Like, this story belongs somewhere else, but it doesn't belong in here. I'm like, man, because that was just me kind of holding on to that last little bit of that Bible study that I was writing. And I thought, okay, I'll just cut it and I'll use it later. And that
Yeah.
was the only thing I had to cut. And that wasn't very much. It was an intro to a chapter.
Okay.
But she wanted me to add more. And I
Okay.
ended up adding about 13,000 words to the manuscript. It ended up being about 82,000. So it's about 15,000 words that were added to the manuscript. And they didn't ask me to cut anything else.
Wow.
So I felt like, okay, Lord, I guess I had to live some more experiences that it ended up in the book. There was a few things that I didn't even plan to put in there that I had to live. And and so that's just kind of how God worked with it. But anyway, here we are.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. And I know your story isn't everybody's story, but bits and pieces of yours I could totally relate to, right? Feeling guilty, having fear. I mean, so much. So while my story might not look exactly the same, it sounds like this would be for any mom, especially just because that's my heart and probably your heart, but like anybody that has those feelings and it doesn't have to look exactly that way. But wow, I can't wait to get my hands on it. Like I'm like, I want to read it right now.
You
I
know,
just love that.
I had one lady that read actually two that read the entire book before they interviewed me, and both
Oh,
said, "Gosh, you shouldn't have just written this. You probably should have written this to parents or to moms that are raising their kids, because it really shouldn't have just been written to moms with children who struggle with addiction, because every mom can identify with something
yeah,
that's making them feel like less than, inadequate, not cut out for the role,
yeah,
guilty." In my case, was it my bad genes? Was it
Yeah.
my own fears, my son, because I asked my kids, like, what did I do wrong? Because the first
Mm.
one I could say, okay, he was just being a little punk, hung out with the wrong kids, didn't listen to his mom, thought, wanted to be a little rebel, and now here we are.
Yeah.
Then when it happened again, though, it was like, okay, I don't get a get out of jail free card this time. Like now the devil's on my back because now we're dealing with two. And I'm sitting there looking at the whole family line. But the interesting thing was I never looked at my husband's family line. And when I
Oh.
looked at his, I was like, hey, there's a lot of problems over there too. But
Mm.
me, because of, he grew up the baby of the family. He said it was like Ozzie and Harriet. Everything was just, leave it to Beaver kind of a family. And he just didn't ever have any of that dumped on him.
Yeah.
Me, it put a broken record in my head. And wouldn't it be just so like God? Not that he created the addiction because
Right.
he didn't want our kids to go through that. But what
Right.
Satan meant for harm,
Mm.
God used for good. And God was like, I'm going to
Amen.
work this out in you. I'm going to
Yeah.
reveal to you some of these things that are going on in you that
Yeah.
no one else can fix. And in the book, there is a section where I talk about a dream that God gave me. And the dream was to reveal a few blind spots. And
Mm.
it's crazy because people can tell you over and over and over again there's something wrong, that something needs changed in your mindset or your behavior or whatever it is. But it's a blind spot. And if it's a
Right.
blind, you cannot see it. It's the craziest thing. And in my
Right.
case, it took a dream that happened a few times before I finally was like, okay, God, what's up? Why am I having this dream? I didn't think I was somebody that God spoke to in dreams. So I just thought weird dreams I gave, like, oh, I must have had too much salsa the night before, stayed up too late, watched some stupid movie or something. But I asked him, and
Yeah.
he was like, okay, now we can talk. Now
Mm.
ask me about this, ask me about that. He was asking me wanted me to ask him about different things in the dreams and what those
Mm.
symbols, what those meant.
Yeah.
And so in that case, now blind spots were starting to come into the light. And once they
Mm.
come into the light, the devil doesn't have any power over you anymore. At this point, you
Right.
have a choice, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where aha moments happen for people who are struggling with either behavioral or substance addictions as well. They talk a lot about hitting rock bottom. I wouldn't say rock bottom is a safe place or a safe prayer. I think it's kind of not a very good description. Ask God to give them an aha moment. Ask God
Mm.
to give them a moment where they say, wow, this isn't working. This is not the life God wants for me.
Yeah.
Lord, what is it you want from me? What are you trying to reveal? What are you trying to show me? And he's faithful, he will do that. He's not holding out. He's not like, well, you should have asked 10 years ago. Since you didn't ask now, I'm not giving you anything. No, he's
Right.
never like that. If
Yeah.
we lack wisdom, it's the Bible tells us that he will give it to us, but we're not to be double-minded, right? Because then we're not going to get anything. We're supposed to believe we'll receive the wisdom.
Right.
So sometimes we're not patient. We think he needs to give it to us the second we ask, but sometimes it's more of a process of him revealing. And
Right.
that's what with me is he started to reveal those areas in my life that were really broken, and he didn't want them to stay that way. So
Oh.
people do ask me, oh, when I come onto something like this podcast, or maybe something that I blog or I put on my social media, well, it sounds like you've arrived.
Mm.
And, well, wouldn't that be nice? I wish I could say I had arrived. Am I better than I was? Yes.
Yeah.
Do I still have a lot of work to do? Yes. And if God had waited for me to be at that place, I probably would be already in the grave and meeting him, be in heaven with
Right.
him. And
Right.
because I think that that's when perfection really comes. We really
Mm.
obtain that place of complete maturity in Christ when we're
Mm.
with him and when we see him face to face. So I think it's going to be a journey. I'm
Yeah.
tested, I'm tested. Fear is tested. There's a lot of things I go through that still trigger me,
Yeah.
but I've learned to handle my triggers differently. I've learned
Right.
to take them to the Lord instead of just going from 0 to 60 instantly in a
Mm.
state of panic. I've learned a little bit more to kind of take some time and
Yeah.
evaluate the situation and see, is it something that requires me to get involved, or should I just be praying? Those kind of things. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Wow. Well, that's amazing and a huge testimony and very, very powerful. So tell us
thank
where
you.
we can find you online or where we can find your book, all that good stuff.
I've been on for a while now, so I think you can kind of find me just about anywhere. If you look up Dawn R. Ward, now the R has to be in there because there happens to be a housewife of Cheshire that lives in England that has the dawnward.com. So it's
Okay,
Dawn R. Ward. I had to put R in the middle of my name on the book, and it just
got
seems
it.
so formal to me. But okay, dawnrward.com or thefaithtoflourish.com.
Okay,
And the faith to flourish does need the in front of it because somebody has faith to flourish. So
okay,
anyway, they're long things you have to type, but anyway, you
yes,
can find me on, Instagram, Facebook, and
hmm.
then of course on my web page as well. And then I think
Awesome.
LinkedIn, I'm pretty much hanging out in most places.
Okay. Well, I will be sure to put those links in here, but thank you, thank you, thank you again. So powerful. And I can't imagine all the lives you're changing and just making an impact with your ministry and with the book. So it's been an honor and a blessing to have you. And it just gives people hope, anybody that's struggling with that fear, with that guilt, there's so much on the other side and we all have our own story, but it's believing and trusting. I've been working with that word trust. So it takes a minute, but it's a beautiful, beautiful journey. And it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. So
Yes.
thank you so much. Bless you. And yeah, I wish you well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Thank you all.
me.
Yeah, thank you all for listening. Again, this is Miranda with the Valuable Voices podcast. Again, I believe everybody has a voice, and my intentions are just to honor and, show God's testimonies and hear his faith, and our faith builds by hearing other people's testimonies. So again, the valuable voices, I love hearing that because there's so many other voices we can be listening to, but for me, God's voice is super valuable. So very, very thankful for Dawn for sharing today. God bless you all.